Good afternoon. It seems, thank you. It seems we filled the place, which is wonderful. Very glad to see so many colleagues and friends join us for today. We're very happy to see representatives from our member states as well. For International IDEA, it's Council Week this week, so that's always a great opportunity for us to offer these kinds of events and benefit from their presence here. So great to see colleagues from the Board of Advisors as well. Welcome. And especially Luisa Neubauer, welcome to International IDEA. We're very happy to have you. I welcome all of you here, both here in Stockholm at International IDEA's headquarters, as well as the colleagues that tuned in online from across the globe to this year's last Stockholm series lecture. My name is Matthias Jäger, and I have the pleasure of coordinating the Institute's broader work on climate change and democracy, of which this initiative forms an important part. The Stockholm series of public lectures on climate change and democracy is not something we do on our own. It is a joint initiative together with a number of institutions, organizations based in Stockholm that have a particular interest on the climate democracy nexus from very different perspectives, namely the Stockholm Environment Institute, the Stockholm Resilience Center, Future Earth, the National Council of Swedish Children and Youth Organizations, LSU, and We Don't Have Time. This series aims to inform, inspire, and engage both experts and the broader public alike by providing quarterly high-profile public lectures followed by debate. Today we're concluding the first year of this initiative. We kicked off the series in April with a brilliant lecture by Jenny King on climate mis- and disinformation and how it manipulates our public debate on climate action. In June and November, we had two very interesting lectures on how climate deliberation, on the one hand side, and different forms of citizen participation, on the other hand, can help make climate policies more inclusive, more effective, and just. And today we want to talk about the importance and the current challenges of climate activism and include that perspective in the bigger picture of our discussions. We are extremely happy that Luisa Neubauer accepted our invitation to come to Stockholm by train, by the way, and not without difficulty, as I learned. So thank you very much. We appreciate the effort. It's been a long train ride, and we're very glad you made it in time and accepted this invitation. We look forward to your lecture and to the following discussion. Luisa Neubauer is a key organizer for Fridays for Future and the most prominent representative of the climate movement in Germany. She has mobilized millions of people for mass protests, leading, among other things, to Germany's coal exit and the first national climate law. In 2021, Luisa was the lead plaintiff in the landmark Neubauer versus Germany case. At that time, the court ruled that insufficient emission reductions violate the liberties of young people, marking a pivotal moment for civil rights in climate policy. Currently, Luisa is building climate alliances between union workers and youth. And in the fall of 2024, recently, she sued the German government again to strengthen social security during the climate transition. Luisa's advocacy has brought her into discussions with world leaders from Barack Obama to Angela Merkel to the Pope. She has won numerous awards for her achievements in raising environmental awareness, and she has published 4 best-selling books on justice and climate, including Beginning to End the Climate Crisis, A History of Our Future. I really cannot think of a better speaker to end our series for this year on a high note. So please join me in welcoming Luisa Neubauer to the podium to deliver this year's last Stockholm Series lecture. The floor is yours, Luisa.
Thank you. Yeah, wow. That was very charming. Thank you. It's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I am very closely connected to a Stockholm-based institution called the Right Livelihood Award Foundation. Maybe you've heard of them. And there was a big award ceremony yesterday night, and so I'm also gladly returning to Stockholm, as I've been working for that foundation as an intern before. So it's very close to my heart to be here and to speak here. Okay. Yes, and today, asking to speak about climate and democracy, I feel it's quite an important moment to acknowledge how many things have changed, and that we are not in that time, in that era anymore, where everyone is talking climate lightly and climate action is understood as given. And I believe we are in a bit of a new era almost when it comes to climate and democracy, and that's what I would like to talk about tonight. And yeah, maybe oh, hello. Yeah, wonderful. Here we are. And I wrote some slides. I'm, as you will see, clearly not a graphic designer, so please bear with me on that end. I would like to start by kind of acknowledging the change of the last 6 years. So as mentioned, I've been a climate justice organizer with many others for the past 6 years, and there was a time in 2019 where I would say almost everything seemed possible. We were on the streets looking like that in Berlin and in 100 and more other countries around the world. And it seemed like there was a era that, looking back, you can consider a pro-planet era, as ironic that seems. And then what followed in 2020 was a pandemic, an energy crisis, international conflict and war, and an era that, seemed very green, a wave that made so much of an unlikely change possible, turned into a time that is much less pro-planet, pro-democracy and pro-future, but more against everything. And this change of time has gotten me a bit wary about these climate talks, a talk like this, as it seems to me that we talk more and more and more, but we listen less and less and less. And trying to be very polite about this, but it almost seems to me that the climate discourse has transformed into something that can be called maybe a stream of muttering, a global self-help group that is pretending that more talking will automatically lead to more action. And it seems to me that part of the climate discourse in these days has started serving the single reason of keeping the illusion alive that we actually know what we're talking about. And increasingly so, I feel we do not know what we're talking about. I feel these conversations are implying that there is a routine in a state of time where there is basically no routine when it comes to climate and democracy, but an unprecedented breakdown in many ways. And in addition to that crisis of the climate we're in, and very closely tied to it, the crisis of democracy we're in, I find that we're also in what you can call a crisis of reason. We know more than everything that we need to know about the crises of our planet and our times. We carry the combined and compressed knowledge in our pockets, every single one of us. And yet, despite all that knowledge around, the crises are deeper and more severe than we would have assumed maybe a few decades ago. So this talk is titled Protecting the Planet and the Democracies, a Dual Imperative and How to Win It. But I just want to kind of flag before that this is not a to-do list. If I had that to-do list on how to solve those problems, I hope we wouldn't be sitting here. But with this talk, what I'm trying to do is to provide some thoughts, some questions, some moments of reflection, and I would very much invite you to challenge me on all of those. If it wasn't winter in Stockholm, I would also propose to maybe skip this talk and go out and connect with nature. But given that, we're not going to do that tonight. So I've kind of renamed my talk today. I called it 10 Theses on the Age of Collapse, trying to just spark some light in a discourse that I tend to find very tiring these days. So my first thesis for tonight would be, it's not 2019 anymore. You remember those days, as I mentioned just before, 2019, 2020, 21. There was a time when climate was winning election, climate was winning minds and hearts, and climate science was, for one, a hot topic in every sense. And this was obviously not the case everywhere, but in more spaces and places than we would have ever imagined. And ever since then, since that green era, the one big question that I'm being asked is, how will we get back to 2019? And the very honest and easy answer is, we will not. 2019 was a historic window of opportunity that was made possible because people had been working not in that time alone, but beforehand. And we will not come back to that time because times are changing and history sometimes does repeat itself, but not in that way. The climate wave of 2019 is what climate scientists and social scientists call a social tipping point, and these are rare. These are very rare, and they depend on those hanging in there in the absence of those very tipping points. So right now we are in what you can call a time, an era of a climate backlash in many ways, and combined an anti-democratic backlash as well. And if we ever want to get back to a time where it's easy again to move forward, to think big, to dream big, what we do now matters, and what we do now should be about dealing with the barriers and the obstacles ahead, and not kind of longing nostalgically and getting lost in this kind of dream about yesterday that will not be there again. So this is the time we have to work with. This is the work environment for all of us, and I propose to take it, to hug it, to embrace that, and to end this wishful thinking for easier times which aren't going to come. Moving on. There was a time, as I mentioned, when it was quite easy for me to be easier-ish to be a public climate activist. Looking back to the last 6 years, I would divide my work into two phases. There was phase one, where my most important job was to make people angry about climate inaction. And there was a second phase, which is the phase we're in right now, where I don't need to make anyone angry anymore because people are angry. And I'm sometimes even happy that they're still angry and haven't resigned yet. So this phase we're in right now is much less about making people angry, but it's about making people hope again. And then this time, I think there is a bit of we are facing a bit of a complicated discourse when it comes to hope. But I would approach this from this end. There is hopelessness around because hopelessness right now seems so very realistic. Why is it realistic to be desperate right now? Because for decades, we have told each other that it's too cheap to wreck the planet and that sustainability is too costly. And yet today, we're finding ourselves in times when the damages attached to climate destruction, to climate damages and to environmental injustice way outperform any of the benefits that we would all witness worldwide if we actually committed to climate justice and climate action. It's so cheap today to protect the planet, and yet we don't see any single country in the world effectively sticking to its climate targets. We find solar energy to be the cheapest source of energy by far, and yet fossil fuels are being expanded everywhere, paid by taxpayers, powered by democratic and autocratic governments alike. We were told for decades that once climate action is cheap enough, we would see climate action is as cheap as ever today, and it's still not anywhere where we need it to be. The despair is also real and realistic, because 6 of our 9 planetary boundaries are hit. Scientists are losing words to explain what is happening to our livelihoods. Our democratic ability to act against these dangers are under attack. These attacks are no longer simply coming from anti-democratic forces, but they come from fake news, from artificial intelligence set out to destruct and destroy. They come from some of the best funded election campaigns that we've ever seen. The idea tracker of the state of democracy has again identified this year a decline of the quality of global democracies. The despair, the hopelessness, the desperation out there is very real, and it's very honest, because the only planet that we have at hand is destructing alongside so many of our democratic qualities. The despair is also real because the project of humanity was in a way always led by the assumption that eventually reason will win. And now we're finding ourselves, as mentioned, in a times where we are more informed than ever before, where in this very moment, there are more educated adults walking on planet Earth than at any time of civilization before. And yet it is the truth, it is the reason, it is the science itself that finds itself under constant attack. We used to say that knowledge is power, and I would say in these days we find knowledge can also be powerlessness. The despair is real, and it's very realistic. We also find ourselves in times where a lot of the assumptions over when people will wake up to the climate disasters are being proven wrong. For a long time we were told that once the catastrophes are here, people will act and they will wake up and governments will go out and do all sorts of things. Well, happy to proclaim the disasters are here, they're impossible to ignore. And instead of more climate action than ever, we find more climate backlash than at least in a long time. The despair is real, and the despair is sadly realistic right now. And that means for us the season of cynicism has arrived. And one of our greatest enemies right now might no longer just be disinformation or denial or fascism, but it also might be the struggle for hope. And this is not just a trend or a lifestyle, but quite an existential moment. And at this point, we might quickly differentiate between convenient and inconvenient hope. Because when it comes to hope, we might fall into quite a few of a cliche discussions that are not helping in my understanding. So what is convenient hope? Convenient hope is understood as something that you can that works like a pizza delivery. Convenient hope is that something that you expect to be delivered to your doorstep. You receive it and you take it back to your couch to sit down just like you used to before, but just with a bit of a better feeling. And outside in that world, nothing has changed. That is convenient hope. Convenient hope to you is a promise from someone else, and you don't really care who it is, that everything is going to be fine eventually. Inconvenient hope, in contrast, is nothing you can order. It means not just expecting the world to be fine or just or whatever. It's expecting yourself to care about this and to do something about the world. The philosopher Rebecca Solnit says this kind of hope is a promise that you give to the world, that you will keep trying, that you will look closely for unlikely windows of opportunities. Inconvenient hope only exists in the context of your own actions. To accelerate action on the protection of climate and democracies, we do not just need more sustainable and feasible solutions. We need people to feel that they are possible and that it is worth fighting for them. People who have given up the possibility for possible change will not see, they will not acknowledge, and they will not engage in trying to work for them. And they wouldn't recognize those very tangible and possible solutions even if they would eventually arrive at their doorsteps. So why am I talking about hope? It's that in my understanding, if we do not solve the crisis of hope we are in, even if all the solutions are raining on all of us, we would find ourselves impossible, paralyzed to see and acknowledge them. People who have given up to the idea that things and times could change will not look out for the change that is actually happening. And more than that, they will never engage in it. And so what does it mean? I'm looking at democratic government, I'm looking at companies, at institutions, at communities, at schools, at movements, organizations, initiatives, to consider their role in the crisis of hope. Are they contributing to this by fueling more empty promises, by fueling that cynicism around, by keeping the impression alive that everything is useless and that we as people are too small to make a change? Or are they creating small beacons of hope, small moments of action, of change? Are they training us to understand hope, not something we have, but something we do? Number 3. Last fall, I traveled to the United States to find out how climate movements navigate under the pressure of extreme weather events on the one side and the pressure of the extreme right on the other side. My time in the US ended at the very week that Donald Trump was voted as a president-elect. So that was a bit of a tricky emotional week, I would say. And so I witnessed the 2 months ahead of the US election. And it is interesting to witness, obviously, what is happening as a climate activist, as someone who kind of cares for a planet to stay in a condition that we can work with it, because the next US administration is going to be the last one until 2030, and 2030, you might know, is that pivotal time, that pivotal moment when emissions should be halved compared to 2010. So, while being in the United States, 2 hurricanes, record-breaking hurricanes, hit the country, causing billions of dollars of damages, destroying family homes and lives in several states. Scientists across the board acknowledged that those hurricanes, and particularly the heavy rains attached to those hurricanes, significantly intensified by the climate crisis. And yet, with those 2 very hurricanes being very visible and very out there, the climate remained almost not to be discussed at all at a meaningful extent throughout the election, which eventually, as we all know, ended in the election of an outspoken climate denier. In the 1980s, the philosopher Günther Anders attested humanity to suffer from something that he would name apocalypse blindness. According to Günther Anders, the people's ability to produce futures has outgrown the people's ability to imagine futures. So what does he mean? He means we can manufacture apocalypse in every imaginable way, but we find ourselves unable to envision the very apocalypse that we ourselves have manufactured. We can produce weapons of mass destruction that cause more harm to people than everything that we've seen before, and yet we have no sense of morality that would be able to grasp those very machineries of death. And similar so today in the climate crisis, we can produce disasters that people and civilizations have never seen before, but there's no ethics that could justify that. There is no understanding of moral, of community, of global responsibility that is as big as the very disasters that humankind has put out there. And that apocalypse blindness appears to have put ourselves in a place where we're confronted with our own action, unable to understand the consequence of those very actions. Apocalypse blindness is also appearing in these days, actually, when we see a rise of autocratic regimes in many places, and the underlying assumptions that those autocratic regimes will automatically lead to an eruption of progressive moments, suddenly living up to the bad guys out there, effectively mobilizing for change that has never seen before. That to me is also apocalypse blindness, because it understates and oversees the very destructive forces of those autocratic regimes in particular, to destruct civil society, to disempower civil society, to create a sense of impossibility, of disempowerment. So why do I talk about apocalypse blindness? Not just because I want to bring down the mood tonight, but to me, looking apocalypse into the eyes actually means empowering ourselves to live up to the very struggles ahead. Günther Anders proposes to do something like stretching exercises, imaginative, moral, or civil society, political stretching exercises to expand our understanding of the world, our understanding of politics towards those very dark corners where we'd rather not look, not to get all depressed and cynical about it, but to expand our understanding of what we can actually do about this. And I find looking back and reflecting on Günther Anders and the US elections, we find that even apocalypse right ahead is still blinding us to take the measures necessary. It's still blinding us to go where we should be going. So when we're talking about the climate conferences, when we talk about climate protection, when we talk about the protection of democracies alike, we need to figure out the bright spots. We need to build hope. We need to obviously, create joy wherever we can. And yet I would strongly propose to consider apocalypse to be part of that toolbox at hand, to train ourselves collectively and individually to not having to be surprised by what we can actually very much calculate to be coming. There's many more to say to that, but we will move on. The apocalypse is it's a bit of a rabbit hole, I realized when doing this this speech. That's number 3. Number 4. The truth is under attack. We mentioned that before, and you mentioned that before in the introduction. In the United States, it struck me how easy it was to end up in these social media holes where people convince each other that Hurricane Milton or Hurricane Helene were in fact planted by the Democratic Party. This is a tweet kind of illustrating that quite well. It was so easy to proclaim that hurricane relief funding designed to help those most affected was illegally sent to states outside. I read of people who would refuse to evacuate when being hit by a hurricane because they considered the whole idea of a hurricane to come to be crooked all along. And at some point I found myself to be humbled, and I would say even surprised, by the sheer existence of anyone left willing to believe in climate science, given the sheer amount of denial in all shapes and forms. And the denial, interestingly enough, is rarely about twisting messengers. It is first and foremost about twisting and delegitimizing messengers. It is about criminalizing and mystifying everyone who would speak up about climate, about the protection of democracies, claiming for them to be secretly up for something else. And that is also something that we increasingly see in European countries that for a long time weren't considered to be the great spaces of climate denial and of the attack against truth. And why is that? Bruno Latour, the ecologist, considered climate science, and I would even say the rule of law when it comes to democracies, to be, and it's not the greatest term that he invented, I think, but he calls it prescriptive potency. What does it mean? He says climate science and democratic values have come along not just as an imperative, but as a to-do list. You read the latest IPCC report and you get quite an idea of what you shall do. So at that moment that we actually see countries and government and institutions finally taking those reports and the climate science seriously, obviously there's increased interest in attacking and delegitimizing those very findings, those very reports, because just the existence of that science comes along with an imperative to act. And similar so, we see that increasingly around democratic institutions, claiming that in many ways our democracies are under attack. So what does it mean? We combine the prescriptive potency of climate science and of democratic values with the emergence of social media tunnels, of Russian interference, of public broadcast and the decline of public broadcast and TikTok algorithms. We find that protecting planet and people and protecting democracies might as well be more about protecting truth than in a very long time. And I think it's important to notice that the denial of realities, it doesn't start with just another multi-billionaire buying up social media platforms. It starts with our everyday language. It starts with voices claiming that one shouldn't talk about the climate because that might be too triggering. We call it green energy. And then once people consider green to be so much of an ideology, they call it clean energy in order to satisfy those who had never any interest in real climate action. For one moment, it seems strategic to change our language to create consensus, and the next moment we find ourselves sticking to discursive rules on climate made up by forces that have no interest in a real and honest climate discourse. It starts with us every day when stopping controversial issues at dinner tables for the sake of a comfortable night, when that kind of sideline denial that we hear from our cousin at a maybe Christmas dinner is being ignored rather than discussed. It starts with governments underfunding public schools and institutions of education, which would be places where people learn how to fact check and understand the difference between facts and feelings. It starts with the decline of local newspapers and small radio stations opening up the doors to large media corporations monopolizing on their very point of view. And that very fight and attack on the truth also starts with the harassment of deregulated online platforms that leads to activists like me and many others having to spend way more time to protecting our work than actually doing our work. It starts with people speaking up, being silenced in spaces uninvited for uncomfortable discussions. Protecting climate and democracies means embracing that there is a difference between my gut feeling and a peer-reviewed fact. It starts with embracing that in political discourse there is denial emerging again, even by those wearing a suit coming along with doctoral degrees. And it also starts with acknowledging that there is tactics and strategies behind crossing lines of dignity, of the rule of law, of democratic values. That there is an interest in derailing debates that should be based on science and not on populism. So today, and I hate to say it, I propose that we extend the struggle for democracies and the struggle for climate justice to the struggle for the truth, which has become more contested than I would have expected these days in our over-informed time in history. Number 5, the climate crisis and the crisis for democracy are a dual imperative. What does it mean? This was 2020. It was a pandemic, so everyone had a lot of time, in particular Angela Merkel, who in that discussion told us that she doesn't have any follow-up meeting, so we can just talk forever, which was quite a scary moment. No, don't worry about you guys. It's a pandemic. I got time. And you imagine in this discussion that Greta, me and some others were having with Angela Merkel, our chancellor back then, we had quite a few disagreements. And Angela Merkel just published a book and she remarked on that meeting, so I now feel very comfortable also remarking on that meeting. It's going to be even. She made this point in that very meeting, and I'm not putting this on her, she was mirroring a very common perspective back then in 2020, which basically went like this. She would say too much climate action would, quote unquote, overwhelm democracies. And it would overwhelm the people and would cause to this kind of spark of right radicals. And so in short, what she would, bless you, in short, what she would say is, do you need some water? Can we get okay? Are you okay? Okay, good. What she was saying, she would say, climate action is very nice, but one side effect might be fascism. And as I said, I think that was a common conception at that time, and probably still is a common conception, so not putting this on her shoulders alone. But it's so symbolic for a very popular misunderstanding of the nexus of climate and democracy. So why is it that climate action is associated with triggering right radicals? And what I suspect behind this understanding is this deep mistrust, and I would say an increased mistrust, between governments and its people. It appears governments are scared in the sense, or tend to be scared of their own people, in the sense that they just assume they cannot handle too much change before freaking out one way or the other. And in a way, I would say kind of makes sense, because change is very exhausting, and, adapting to new rules and realities can overwhelm people. And I guess we all experience that in our everyday lives. It's not too far of a take to acknowledge that expecting people to change one way or the other is a daring, task for a government that has a big interest in, keeping everyone calm and steady. So I understand why governments, and back then also Angela Merkel, who took that stance, by the way, as a explanation for what I find, and me and the Constitutional Courts and quite a few others consider to be insufficient climate action. I understand why governments are hesitant to ask for too much. What I do not understand is the assumption that less climate action will lead to less change for people. It is the very climate reality that is telling us day in, day out, that less climate action will lead to more climate change. And that climate change that is coming will not ask people politely to adapt in a democratic and orderly way, but it will ask people to adapt in a chaotic and catastrophic way. So protecting democracies without protecting the very material foundation of those democracies is a fairy tale. And that's a fairy tale that is doomed to eat itself up. So really caring about democracies in today's world, where there is no denying of the climate realities ahead that are hitting even the most privileged part of the world, really caring about those democracies today must consist of the acknowledgement that the trust between people and the government is at stake once preventable catastrophes aren't being prevented, even though we very much know about them. And it must mean preventing chaos that can be prevented. And it must mean today allowing us to rest. After all, that's what democracies need. They need time to breathe. They need time for people to slow down, to recalibrate to a change of time. And frankly speaking, one of the most crucial resources that the climate crisis is eating up is time. It's time to navigate, it's time to plan ahead, it's time to consolidate and connect with each other. We do not have time in the climate crisis, and that is very much why we must take the time to protect our democracies through protecting people from climate disasters. And I find the pandemic to be quite a crucial example of what happens to a society when governmental decisions are having to be so fast and so immediate that people have less and less time to associate themselves with the new changes ahead. not wanting to get into a debate about corona, like about pandemic rules, but what we see in the long run is the detrimental damages done to many societies out there. Damages that are only playing out years after of that deep mistrust that has been piling up between people and the government. And I would assume a lot of that has to do with that immediate pace that had to be put on to people. And there's other questions or other issues attached. If we decide to protect democracy through climate inaction, what we produce is, very materially spoken, costs. We increase the budget that needs to be allocated to climate damages, to climate adaptation, to rebuilding after disasters. A few years ago, one of the worst floods in years had hit Germany, causing costs of 30 billion euros, just allocated to rebuild what has been damaged, and that is, that doesn't bring anyone back to life that has been killed by that disaster. So, in what world do we assume that we will have enough money and state budgets left to invest in infrastructure and social infrastructure and housing and education, also in the economy, if our climate disaster that we could have prevented or at least slowed down are eating up more and more and more of our budget? What money in the world do we expect that we have left to invest in the future if so much of our resources are being occupied by kind of running behind the disasters that we could have actually slowed down? So protecting our planet without protecting our democracy, and vice versa, is maybe another fairy tale that we might break up with. And in contrast to that, what we're seeing, that protecting democracies through sustainable and just climate action offers maybe some of the greatest social and political innovations at hand, making sure that people everywhere actually learn that we have tools that are needed to protect ourselves, to rise up to challenges that we can actually foresee, that we do know our ways to introduce just measures that bring back people together. Why is it, though, that climate and democracies are under attack? We have obviously quite an understanding of what caused the climate crisis. We know that the vast majority of emissions are caused by fossil fuel industries, and yet it is no coincidence that the climate crisis and the crisis of democracy are emerging quite at a similar moment in time. And obviously there's many reasons to every single of those crises, but there's one big connection between the crisis of democracy and the crisis of the climate. This is it. Sorry. Yeah. Oh no, there's an image missing. Never mind. Okay. One key supporter of Donald Trump were fossil fuel industries. They donated $14 million to the Trump campaign alone. This outperforms budgets of entire electoral campaigns in other countries. $14 million to the Trump campaign only by big oil and gas. And this doesn't even account for the large variety of other support mechanisms. So obviously, there's one very obvious way in which it makes sense that fossil fuel industries have an interest in electing a climate denier. It's obviously their business plan to stay in business, to keep expanding, and anyone, kind of closely attached to, say, international climate agreement would be a problem for an average fossil fuel company. And this is supported, luckily enough, by the UN. The UN, after 20 years of embarrassingly low outcome climate negotiation, actually in 2023 acknowledged that we as a global community should transition away from fossil fuels. And that is obviously a very poor outcome in the world of unprecedented climate disasters and climate breakdown, but given that we are navigating in a world that for 250 years has turned into what you could call a pyrotechnical party, a world that is run on burning stuff, the idea that we collectively transition away from fossil fuels might be quite close to a revolution. And we know, of course, that agreements at the United Nations Conference of the Parties tend to be forgotten the day after. But we're also navigating in a world where right now more than 1,000 climate litigation cases are being discussed, a world that knows more and more and more about how to protect itself against fossil fuel interests. So for an average fossil fuel company, would be part of the 95% of the oil and gas industries that are planning to expand. Any of those global plans to transition away from fossil fuels are risking their business. And right now we're seeing it's not only fossil fuel companies who are being at risk by climate targets, we're also seeing petrol states and fossil fuel autocracies like Azerbaijan, the one that just hosted the climate conference, are being increasingly under pressure by international climate agreements simply because it puts their very model of existence at risk. So an average company involved in fossil fuels wanting to expand a coal mine, a pipeline, or a gas field obviously has very little interest in international justice and democratic order, simply because we are ourselves asking them to break up their dirty business. But it is more than that. We are not only seeing that more and more fossil fuel interests are getting involved in climate in campaigns on political elections, but what we are also seeing, and that is very interesting, more and more fossil fuel industries getting involved into the pushback against climate movements, delegitimizing climate activists, suing non-governmental organizations. We are seeing organizations as big as Greenpeace being at risk of having to close down offices over the pressure that they're experiencing from fossil fuel industries. So while there are a trillion reasons why democracies are at risk, one of those might as well be the increased risk of business of fossil fuel interests. And when looking at how we can protect democracies, we might as well take a look at who is attacking those democracies right now. And we might as well engage in a bit more of an outspoken language against companies that are openly violating our democratic values virtually everywhere. Number 7. Greenwashing is a concept that has been quite vocal everywhere. We see greenwashing being something that has been discussed in many places, companies covering up their actions that are associated with fossil fuel industries and fossil fuel emissions to appear more shiny, more green, more future ready or whatever. And I would assume greenwashing today to be, quite frankly, one of the most destructive activities you can do, because you don't only imply that the things are better than they actually are, but you also imply that more action is not necessary because everyone is moving towards the right direction. You're creating an illusion, another fairy tale of a different state of the world that we are in. You're disengaging others who would maybe go out and actually fight for something. Greenwashing means disengaging who would be doing something for the sake of your own dirty business. And maybe the automobile industry of Germany is one of the greatest examples how criminal networks are building up in one of the most powerful industries that we have, just for the sake of not having to stick to international values, to international climate agreements, to European emission standards. And the interesting thing about greenwashing is that it's closely connected what you can call democracy washing. So what we see increasingly the last years is that under the apparent protection of democracies, climate movements and climate players are being oppressed. What does it look like? Countless democracies like the German one, but also the British democracy, or in places quite liberal like Switzerland, we see laws oppressing public mobilization and public protest in the name of protecting the rule of law. We see climate activists being criminalized in the name of our constitution in places like Germany. We see funding being cut to organizations that are involved with peaceful civil disobedience as political science, as meanwhile showing us that a strong democracy also must have the space for peaceful and democratic civil disobedience. So what we're seeing is not only the climate being under attack from fossil fuel industries, from autocrats, from fascists, but also from greenwashing industries alike. We are also seeing that those who are set out to protect our climate, our livelihoods against that very backlash are also under attack, ironically so, in the name of our democracies. And this isn't just something that has to do with laws being put in place to crack down protests and make it harder and harder and harder for organizations to find funding or legal support. That also starts again in our very language. Who is a terrorist in the climate crisis? Who is a criminal in the climate crisis? Who is the one imposing a danger on a society, and who is the one we can trust in a society? We are quite a few months ahead of a big German election, and it's very interesting to witness right now, and obviously quite scary to witness, that our very fossil fuel industries are the ones that shall be protected from change, while virtually everyone around them, societies, movements, institutions alike, are expected to adapt to whatever that means for society. So we protect a status quo in order to imply peace and calmness and a steadiness in a society, while expecting everyone around to adapt to more chaos, more disruption, more uncertainty in these days. And that again has to do with the idea of democracy washing. Democracy washing also means implying that a democracy is always at a stable state, and everyone proposing change is risking for that democracy to cripple, which is an interesting contrast to the science of political science behind democracy, saying to us actually democracies have always been evolving, and democracies that are put in a place to not move are the ones that are most at risk, not being resilient enough to live up to today's challenges. And here again, however, we see who apparently has a right to change and who doesn't have a right to change. In order for fossil fuel industries to maintain their business for as long as we can think, government budgets are expected to put more and more subsidies on those very industries to help them stay where they are, which means, again, funding is being taken away from other institutions that would be a willing driver of change. We do not have time for that. Yes. But it's also, I guess I'm making the point to make sure that we talk about these things, because both greenwashing and democracy washing for a long time have been implied to be this like nitty-gritty side effect, an Instagram problem, someone kind of putting too nice word on something that isn't so nice, a bit of a too green PowerPoint presentation for a bit of a dirty business. And yet both of those things are very much connected to the issues I mentioned before, to the attack on truth and honesty and science, because both imply that we can create detached realities that exist in this well-being space where things aren't changing in the way they are actually. Again, coming back for my kind of new defined love for the apocalypse. We're moving on. There was a case the other day which I found very interesting, a Swedish situation where a wind park and an onshore wind park was set to be built on indigenous reindeer land. The ones of you living in Sweden are probably more familiar with that. And to me, it's a very interesting, a very crucial reminder of the quality of solutions that we're needing. We're moving on to the solution side of this talk, by the way. So what does it mean when we acknowledge there is a crisis of the climate, there is a crisis of democracies, there is a crisis of truth, and there is a crisis of hope? And all of those meet. What does it mean for us when we talk about solutions? And I guess we are in a time where we should challenge old solutions designed for old crises that are coming from times when we still assumed that there was something like a singular crisis. So a crisis that was detached from other issues, that was in a way detached from the outside world almost, that was an isolated problem that we could talk about in an isolated way. And I would propose that we think about any of these crises to not be singular anymore, but to be of an intersectional nature. In coming to Walter Benjamin, a very great German philosopher, who in the 20th century proposed the idea that progress is eating itself up. So he was saying we have embarked on this kind of journey of progress that is moving us forward, but producing so many problems by the side that more and more progress is being forced on us in order to solve more and more problems that we, with our very progress, have produced. And I worry that in terms of climate, we are embarking on that very same journey. We are embarking in the worst case on a journey on solutions that will produce more and more side effects, more and more associated problems, forcing us to risk even more, to bet on even more uncertain solutions in order to find any way to live up to the crisis that we've produced. One example would be climate solutions that are in conflict with indigenous rights. We see in other ways budget cuts on social welfare in order to fund climate action, which of course, it's eating itself up. It means social security will be under attack, creating insecurity and inequality among a community that is asked at the same time to deal with the climate crisis. It's eating itself up. Another example would be media outlets embarking on climate issues detached from the state of the economy, implying that we can solve the climate crisis at one point and produce more dirty energies on the other side. Another, I think, quite good example would be the idea of talking about global justice without talking about the freedom of migration, implying that we are not taking away people's homelands every single day. So I would say there's the list is endless of solutions that maybe sound great, but produce so many side effects that we will never ever get in front of the wave of price that we've been producing. And what is on the other side? And I think that is so beautiful. On the other end of a singular solution is a synergetic solution. What does it mean? It is a climate answer that solves more than one problem at the same time. What would be examples for that? It would be creating jobs around solar energies in deprived communities. It would mean strengthening indigenous rights through the protection of nature. It would mean investing in youth and education to support democratic institutions. It would mean investing in international trust and international institutions through climate payback and so on and so forth. And the more you think about it, I would propose, the more beautiful it is. It means that we can stop claiming that we have to divide our worries for different crises. It would mean ending the idea that we can play out one crisis against the other. It would mean the end of the fairy tale that there is no solution that fits for all. There are some solutions that fits for many, but it's up to us to investing the time and the energy to actually find those very solutions. And that brings us to those guys. What isn't a solution? There were many voices. I'm getting to the end of my, I'm seeing the nerves here. When I started my activism with many others, one big thing that I encountered was confusion. A lot of people being very, very, very confused that it's angry teenagers on the streets kind of challenging their political legacy. And I sympathize with that. I thought it was so nice and humbling for people to be confused about the existence of an emergent youth movement. But why is that so? Because we are trained to believe that the big and important changes for us are usually coming along with man, machine, and money, not with emotion, climate movements, and young people. And that, I think, tells us a lot about how our thinking is designed to serve the tech bros out there and their innovations, and not the huge variety of other innovation that are out there. And I'm not arguing against technological innovation. I mean, it's a technological innovation that brought us renewables and all these things. That is great. I just propose to extend our understanding of where change could be coming from to social, culture, political, scientific changes, community changes, self-made changes, DIY changes, change that is coming from the periphery. Yet as long as we are fixed on those guys, spending all our time and attention to them and their existence, it will mean we do not have the attention and the ability to look closely to all the other corners in the world where the changes are coming from. And I'm proposing that the big positive change that we're needing to see will very much not come from Elon Musk and his friends, but they will come from the unlikely spaces, the unlikely alliances, the unlikely court cases, the very small people coming together to do small steps that pile up to bigger steps. And I think here again we will see the beauty in synergetic thinking that only comes along when you stop isolating yourself with only like-minded people and start having a real talk about the problems ahead. And finally, bringing up some Swiss vibes to the end of this talk, what is it that we're working towards? I started with apocalypse, and we're ending, of course, as you do, with utopia. There's so much to talk about when it comes to utopia. Maybe we have a moment in our discussions. But to finish on this thought, just as well as I propose to get very real and honest about the apocalypse and what is blinding us to see unexpected change that is no longer unexpected because we have all the reports telling us that this change is coming. On the other end, I think we must ask us very honestly and very precisely, what are we expecting to see at the end of the tunnel? And I worry that Hollywood hasn't done us a good job here in creating a utopia that I think is a bit of a misleading idea. Utopia to me doesn't mean that we will end up in this eco-environmentalist, happy democracy, fairy tale country fair where all of us are dancing together to kind of the rising sun. But what I find way more hopeful and realistic is to understand utopia not to be this set in stone state, but for us to acknowledge or to understand utopia as a routine, as a practice, as a mode. What does it mean in climate? To give an example, in climate, it wouldn't mean that every single day in, day out, climate is on all headlines. Every single day, all of us have to stand on the streets to prove that we actually care. But in climate, it would mean that we introduce an ecological routine to our lives, to our governments, to our institutions, to our politics, saying whenever we make a decision on what we do, how we go ahead, how we make a plan, climate plays a role, the emissions plays a role, the ecological justice plays a role. Introducing a routine so we can stop freaking out at times and calm down a bit. Same for democracy. When talking about budget cuts, talking about governments, talking about also our community management, talking about how we set up school systems, where do we train our democratic muscle? Where do we train to negotiate, to have uncomfortable discussions? Where do we train to acknowledge the discrepancies between the world we live in and the world we like to live in? Where do we train our democratic understanding of how we act and react to the world ahead? That also would mean we can stop being the annoying ones in the room because we know we've introduced a practice that thinks about the protection of democracies even when there's no one standing up and shouting and screaming. And that for us means that is the beauty, that utopia, or ideally something we're working towards, is something that has the capacity to constantly reflect itself. To come back and to think how we could do it better, which would take away so much of the pressure that we now have to put on the single solution because we must expect it to deliver it in every single sense. What possible solution could there be to live up to those standards? Utopia as a practice would mean we can calm down on that end as well, because we know if it doesn't work out, we come back, we reconsider, and we bring up something that works out in a better sense. It means we allow ourselves to fail because we have the capacity to still try again. Because we haven't bet on that single card that must be everything for everyone, but we know that eventually we have that sense of that newness, the uniqueness of the times ahead offers us to also be new in the way that we deal with that. And I think that for me is a quite promising approach. Maybe so much. Thank you.